Welcome back. So now, as with the last couple of response videos, I am recording this introduction retrospectively after having responded to the video itself, just for time's sake. So you'll notice that my hair will grow exponentially longer in the actual response section of this video as opposed to this intro and the outro. But today I'm going to be looking at a video called How Atheism is the Weakest Worldview by the channel Answers in Genesis Canada. And of course, Answers in Genesis are a very well-known Christian and I believe creationist apologetics organisation out of Australia, I believe, with Ken Ham. So without further ado, let's have a look at how atheism is the weakest worldview. Introduction to Philosophy. Coffee. That's not a latte.
Christians who engage in arguments against the story of evolution often discover something quite quickly. Although they may think that this is a predominantly scientific issue, many times believers find themselves in a philosophical debate instead, as skeptics sometimes try to undermine the very concept of biblical absolutes rather than discussing specific scientific facts. For example, some form of the argument that you can't know anything for certain is used all the time in schools, colleges, universities, particularly.
So, as human beings, we're only limited to see and experience and measure the world as far as we're able to. We can't measure reality as it is. And science is not aimed at finding the certain aspects of reality. We can't ever say that we know something for certain. The point in science is to develop theories that are the strongest, most powerfully evidenced positions to get as close to certainty as we possibly can, because getting to 100% certainty, as I say, is not possible.
Against Christians that say they can know 1, the Bible as truth, and 2, truth incarnate, Jesus Christ. The logical sequential argument used to attack the concept of absolute truth usually unfolds like this. Have you ever known something?
The problem I have with using the Bible as a document of truth is, A, it was written by men. B, it was written a long time ago, and has been subject to, 2,000 or so years of people taking it. I can't convince myself that the original interpretation and the original meanings behind the teachings that were displayed in the Bible all those years ago in a different culture, in a different language system and way of communicating is the same now. Because to me that's just very, it's possible, it's just to me very, very difficult to believe.
Something to be certain, but then gained some additional knowledge that overturned your original conclusion, and you found out that you were wrong? Well, yes is the obvious answer. Does any human being have all knowledge?
No.
Well, no would be rightly concluded. So couldn't there just be one bit of information that you don't have right now that could overturn what you think to be true? Then you could be...
And one needs to be very open to that, because otherwise that's not skepticism, that's not science, that's not seeking, that's dogma at that point.
Wrong about everything you think you know right now. And yes is the mantra expected. Then, if you don't know everything, you can't know anything for certain, they'll conclude. But how can they conclude that they can know this for certain is usually never discussed, as it's a circular argument that self-destructs upon...
Well, again, reality is only reality as far as our human bodies have been evolved to interpret it, or have been, if we want to take intelligent design as the cause of life of human beings, then as far as we've been designed to interpret it, we don't see the world as it is. We only see the world as far as our brains are able to interpret the senses that it gets. And we find laws, we find rules of the universe that are consistent. We can't ever say for 100% certain that they'll always be consistent, because we don't know that. There's no way of knowing that. Something could change on a quantum level that makes the universe disappear in half a second, or completely changes the rules of the universe entirely. But again, that doesn't mean that we can know the universe as it is. We just know certain behaviours of the universe and can say that they will happen consistently. What's causing those laws and what's causing the things that we see?
Examination. However, my experience over the years has taught me that the truth of God's Word truly will set you free. So,
another problem I have with that is that let's take for granted that God spoke the words to the scribes of the Bible. The problem I have then, if we look at things like evidential mediumship or just mediumship in general, where a spirit, whatever you believe that to be, tries to put across information, or a channeler, for example, tries to put information from these extra physical sources, I suppose, onto paper, or to the person that's employed them as a medium, you'll find that there's an awful lot of difficulty there, because that person then has to interpret the messages that they're receiving, often in symbols, vague symbols or whatever else, and try and interpret the meaning of the message that the spirit intends to put across. So if God did generate the Bible through individuals, God doesn't have hands, he can't write on paper. So we know it was the texts were originally written, I mean, I don't know if pens or tablets and rocks or whatever else it was back then. I'd imagine parchment. But God can't do that because he doesn't have the physical traits to do that. So it had to go through a person, which means that any messages that he, she, it transferred to this person has to go through their interpretation, their lens, their culture, their beliefs, their ways of communicating, their biases, etc., to go through onto that piece of paper or piece of parchment. And then again, I just can't convince myself that over 2,000 years, that exact meaning, considering how different our culture is now, let alone whether any changes were made by rulers as a way of keeping people in line, which I don't know. But if that was the case, there's more than enough years to make that a reasonable belief, I believe. I can't fathom that the teachings in those texts are exactly what the writers or the scribes originally intended the meaning to show.
You're feeling flummoxed right now over this philosophical conundrum? The following true story might help you sort it out.
Question there. Is atheism a worldview, or is it a lack of a worldview? I would say it's a worldview, because one believes that there is no God, or simply does not believe in a God. Depends how you define atheism. And it gets all messy when people have different ideas of atheism. But effectively, the idea is, if you were to ask, do you believe there's a God? No. Okay, atheist. Again, difficult, because then what do you mean by God? And it gets all messy, so I just prefer to ask questions and get someone's opinion rather than trying to label it, because that comes with all sort of baggage. But in that case, that would, of course, that belief or lack of belief in a God would shape one's opinion of the world and of life itself. So yes, I would say that atheism is a worldview. Some try to argue that it's a religion. There are aspects of forms of atheism that I've seen that are very religious in terms of the dogma that is followed. But no, atheism is not a religion. It's a lack of kind of a belief in something.
Years ago, I was speaking at an event in British Columbia to what I assumed was a Christian audience. Glancing to my right as I finished and stepped off the platform, I guessed by the look on the man's face approaching me that this likely wasn't going to be an overly pleasant conversation, and I wasn't wrong.
Red flag.
Announcing himself as an atheist.
As soon as you see that, don't engage, because that person isn't going to listen. They're not going to consider any other possibilities other than themselves. If they're coming at you aggressively, they're there to tell you you're stupid and you should go and die in a hole somewhere. Usually, if it's the internet, that's mild, but in person, maybe people wouldn't be quite so abrupt. But if you see that aggressive approach, don't engage. Not worth it.
And the professor of philosophy at a local university, the man began aggressively informing me how ludicrous my presentation on God's existence and the Bible being real history was. Being aware that just 6 months previous to this, another Christian apologist I knew had been intellectually mauled by someone with a similar attitude and credentials in this location, I suspected that this was likely the same fellow.
A person has more than the right to share one's beliefs. You have more than the right to not be convinced by it, but you don't have the right, well, you do have the right, I suppose, to argue in an aggressive way, but it's just unnecessary, and it just doesn't do any good. It just makes you hate each other more, and you're not going to learn anything from each other, because neither of you is going to want to engage with the other person, one, because he thinks you're stupid, and B, because this person is being overly aggressive that you don't want anything to do with him. So you're not going to listen to what he says, he's not going to listen to what you say, and you're just going to get annoyed and raise your blood pressure. What's the point? Engaging people only that are willing to listen and to accept that they may be wrong and that you have something to teach them.
He seems specifically annoyed by me using the Bible to confirm the Bible because of what he perceived to be a circular argument. And as often happens in these informal debate settings, a crowd began to form around us to watch the proceedings. After a blistering initial salvo of scientific proofs of the story of evolution, followed by a large volume of knowledge that he'd obviously meticulously prepared to hammer the biblical creationist position, he paused briefly, seemingly interested in how I'd react to his challenges.
And just to add, the term story of evolution is accurate. So evolution is a story of the way that we believe the human being came to be. However, the word story alone indicates fiction. At least to me it does. When you hear story, you immediately think, fairy tales. You think of fiction, or you think of my book, Russet, which is, go to my website to have a look. But I don't like the term story when we're talking about scientific theories here, because yes, evolution is a story of how we came to be, but it's a very, 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 very highly evidenced one from various different independent sources of evidence. And as I mentioned in one of the shorts that I did, a scientific theory is not just a guess, it's not just a story, it's the closest to certain we can come on any particular phenomenon. That doesn't mean that it's, as I say, certain. It doesn't mean that it's complete. It can be worked upon, but it's basically that all the evidence that we've seen and all the falsification we've attempted to make on the theory has failed, and so, or rather, that probably sounded wrong. So all the falsifications every time we've tried to falsify this position of evolution has failed, and we've had so much evidence coming from various different sources, various different avenues of independent evidence, and it's held up to scrutiny so many times, it's just irrational to assume that it must be fundamentally wrong. So yes, it's a story, but it's a damn good one.
Wanting to get to the heart of the matter, and because of his background as a PhD in philosophy, I took a different tack than I usually would. "So, you're a professor of philosophy here, sir?" I asked. And he straightened himself up with a confident smile and confirmed that he had his doctorate in philosophy. So I said, "And philosophy includes the study of epistemology, of how you can know things, isn't that right?" And he confirmed that as well. "Then, can I ask you a question? Can you tell me one thing that you know for certain and how you came to know it?"
That I exist. Other than that, no.
He looked at me seemingly annoyed and asked what I meant. So I repeated to him that I'd just like him to tell me one fact or bit of knowledge that he knew for certain and how he came to know it. He said, "Well, I know I'm standing here," so I asked him how he knew it.
You don't know that, because what if you're lying in a bed somewhere and this is all a big hallucination or a drug trip, or you're plugged into the Matrix somewhere and made to believe that this virtual reality is your life? You don't know that. You know that you exist because you experience. That's the only thing I believe that we can actually be certain of. Can I say that? I think so.
Putting his finger on my chest, he said, "Well, because I can see you and touch you and I can feel the floor." "So what you're telling me is that your 5 senses are informing you that you're here, correct?" Mm-hmm. To which he said, "Well, of course. But how do you know that your senses are actually working correctly? How do you know that you're just not some brain in a jar somewhere being fed impulses that make you think you're really here? How do you know that you're not in a matrix and this is all just an illusion?"
I haven't seen this, I promise.
You can't tell me that your senses are confirming your senses, because that would be a circular argument, correct? And you don't believe in circular arguments, right, sir? He caught on to what I was getting at and responded, "Well, actually, I can't know anything for certain, but neither can..."
You can. You exist. You're having an experience. You can't be certain of what you're experiencing is real, but the pure I am, that can't not exist, because in order to exist or not exist, you need a sense to know what exists or doesn't exist. I know what I'm trying to say.
"Can you?" Continuing, I asked, "Okay, so just to confirm, what you're saying is that in your worldview as an atheist, you have no way or mechanism of being able to know anything for certain?" He said, "Well, no, ultimately," but then again added, "But neither can you." So I said, "Wait a minute. I'm a Christian, and I believe in God. And not just any God, the God of the Bible, who's all-seeing, knowing, omnipotent, exists outside of time, and has created everything. Now, if the God of the Bible exists, could he give his creatures faculties and reveal information to them, revelation, so that they could know things for certain?
Well, if he was omnipotent and could do anything, then logically, yes.
I don't believe in God, he said, waving his hand, trying to dismiss the argument.
Depends what you mean by God. If you mean the Christian God as did he give his name? Calvin Smith. I'm assuming Dr. Smith. I don't know. We'll call him Calvin. If it's the God of the Bible as Calvin mentioned, then that's one definition of God. My definition of God would be a form of, or a fundamental aspect of nature, perhaps consciousness, which we are all part of. But again, atheism, this is why I don't like the language or the term atheist, because it predetermines what you mean by God. Like if I was to say to someone, do you believe in God? And they say, no, I'm an atheist. And I'll say, okay, I believe that consciousness is fundamental, that we are part of it. You say, oh yeah, well, I'm an idealist. I do believe that. I believe we're all part of a mind. And I'd say, well, that's what I mean by God. So it's difficult. You have to make sure you thoroughly kind of define what we're talking about, what you're talking about in a conversation to get the most out of it.
Said, I know that that's what you profess, but that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking, if the God of the Bible exists, could he do that? Could he give his creatures abilities so that they could know things for certain? Well, of course he could, because he's God, he said, rolling his eyes. Okay, so let's get this straight. What you're saying is that if your atheistic worldview is true, you can't know anything for certain. But if my worldview is true as a Christian, I can know things for certain?
If we take for granted that God can provide his creations with ultimate knowledge of everything, then yes, if that were true, then in that worldview you could know everything. But the question is that worldview true? And as we are now, how do we know that? Can we know that? Can we know that purely from the religious texts that tell us that? Yes, because this omnipotent God who describes himself as being able to give us the knowledge of everything, told us through scripture that is what he is. Okay. How do we know that that's true? How do we know that what God said to us through this Bible, how do we know that God did determine this Bible? God did determine this text that tells us what he is? Well, because that's what God has put through to the text. Yes, but how do we know that that's came from God? You see the problem. That's why it's circular, because how can you ever determine for certain that this is from God and that what is written there is exactly what was intended to be meant by the original texts? Because surely if it was certain that God was this way and that we have absolute knowledge, we would know that, and we wouldn't have to question whether that's the case. Maybe I'm thinking of this the wrong way. But from my position, I can only talk about my position. I'm not a Christian, so I don't have this level of knowledge, of certainty that this gentleman does, which fair enough to him. Maybe he knows a lot more about things than I do. But from my perspective, I could never convince myself that God wrote the Bible, because I would always be asking, well, how do we know that? Well, because that's what God wrote in the Bible. Yes, but how do we know God wrote the Bible? How do we know that it was influenced from God and not from just somebody? Because that's what the Bible teaches. Yes, but how do... You see, it goes round for me. But again, I'm not a biblical scholar, so I don't know enough to really say, but this is just how I would think about it.
Well, absolutely, but I don't believe in your God, he said. So I looked at him and said, absolutely? You know that absolutely? I thought you just told me if your worldview was true that you couldn't know anything for sure.
But he's also human, and you've got him on the spot, kind of as much of an arse as he's being. He's gonna say things that contradict himself, because we're human. That's what we do. We're not perfect things. We just never really think about these things. So I think it's unfair to pick someone up on the words they use when that's not necessarily what's meant in the heat of the moment.
So how do you know that with certainty? He looked at me and opened his mouth and reconsidered, paused again, turned, and then blustered out something about how science strongly supported evolution, even if he couldn't know it for certain. After I asked him how he knew that for certain, he muttered something about utter skepticism and walked away, leaving the circle of onlookers baffled by the brief exchange. I learned afterwards that this man apparently prided himself on challenging Christians whenever possible, so they were quite surprised when he exited the arena so quickly. You see, logically, to be able to have an argument or discussion concerning the truth of any topic, certain conditions must be assumed by all parties prior to even beginning the process. One must assume that we exist, that logic is real, and that knowledge...
One must assume that we exist. But to assume anything, one must exist. So is it an assumption that we exist, or is that, as I would say, kind of the only thing that we can be certain about? Because everything in life is dependent upon the fact that we exist, or that I exist. Because if I didn't exist, for me, none of this would exist. I wouldn't be able to make assumptions. I wouldn't be able to have beliefs. So I exist. I wouldn't say that's an assumption. I would say that's the only thing that we can be certain of.
Knowledge is attainable. But as the atheist professor confirmed, if someone doesn't start with the idea of God's existence, nothing can be assumed with certainty, which means knowledge is actually not possible. One cannot know anything for certain. No wonder our discussion was short. Why would someone have a conversation about what's correct or incorrect with someone that doesn't know anything?
So again, with the Christian perspective that God has revealed absolute knowledge to us, how do we know that? Because that's what's written in the text, that's what we were taught. Because God wrote so in the Bible through his messengers. But how do we know that that's true? Again, this is just how I would think about it. I struggle to come from a perspective of we can know anything other than I exist, because I mean, how can we? Anything, the reality is so complex, and everything we think we know about what it is going to be so far removed from what it actually is, because we are only limited by our abilities to interpret it, that anything could be real, anything could be true, anything could be false, even if it's infinitesimally wrong to what we currently believe. Now, how can we have absolute knowledge on anything other than I exist and I am experiencing?
That person will always be learning and never able to arrive at a knowledge of truth, as 2 Timothy 3 says. How could you build knowledge precept upon precept, as Isaiah 28 describes, if you can never be certain about the starting assumption you began with? Now, some atheists have told me that even though we can't know things for certain, we can know things to a high degree of certainty, which makes their beliefs reasonable. My question for them is, do you know that you can know things to a high degree of certainty for certain? Now, some atheists have told me that even though we can't know things for certain, we can know things to a high degree of certainty, which makes their beliefs reasonable.
I have 10,000 balls. 9,999 of them are red. One of them is white. I smash the bag around, reach in, they're small balls. I reach in and I pick out one ball. I say, this is going to be a red ball. Do I absolutely certainly know that? No. Is it reasonable to believe that? I've got a 1 in 10,000 chance. Or, a 1 in 10,000 chance. I'd say that's pretty reasonable. Now I have 1,000,000 balls in a bag. 999,999 of them are red. One of them is white. I don't know for absolute certain that I'm going to pick out a red ball. I've already picked out a ball 50,000 times and they've all been red. Now I have evidence to back up my claim that the next ball I pick up is going to be red, even though I can't be 100% certain that it will be. I'd say that's a reasonable statement to make, that the next ball I pick out is going to be red. Not a perfect analogy, maybe, but kind of makes a point, I think.
All worldviews make truth claims to support their system. And the argument against atheism is not that they don't know anything. Many of them know a great deal. The argument is that in an atheistic worldview, they can't account for what is known as the preconditions of intelligibility, or how you can know anything at all, which proves their worldview is incorrect. The mere fact that they can...
That might just be a me problem, but that went over my head. I struggled to comprehend what his argument was there. You can't Can't have a prerequisites for knowledge, is that right?
Declare certainty argues against their worldview. The bottom line is this.
Don't declare certainty. Well, say we as if I'm an atheist. It depends how you define atheist. But as someone who doesn't believe in the biblical God, I personally don't ever declare certainty that God doesn't exist, because I don't know. As he rightly says, we can't know anything other than I exist. I think it's highly unlikely that the Christian God exists, and I hope it doesn't. But I can't be sure, because I can't know, because I'm human, and I can only interpret the world and reality as far as I'm able to. If the Christian God does exist and would reveal himself to me as I've asked him to many times, perhaps he has reason not to yet. Perhaps he will. I hope he does, because I'd like to know for certain, of course, and avoid whatever comes of not believing. But until then, how could I ever say that I know for sure that he doesn't exist? Because he could do, and just be out of my ability to measure him.
In order to know anything for certain, an individual would either have to have all knowledge or be empowered by the one that has all knowledge. You'd either have to be God or be created by God. But either way, God would exist. People that hold to different views of who God is may have difficulty defending their beliefs consistently, but at least they have what they claim is an ultimate being that can provide the conduit to true knowledge.
In which case, for my worldview, that would be the fundamental framework of consciousness of which we are all part, and which we seem to return to, at least in some capacity, following our deaths, and are always connected to, but are limited by our physical bodies to be able to access the information that it has, because it, in and of itself, is the universe. Is an expression. The universe is an expression of it, I suppose, in some very complex way that I can't even begin to understand. So perhaps then one could consider that I do believe in God, just not a separate God as is defined by Christianity and other monistic religions.
Atheists can't. This encounter confirmed to me once again that, far from what many people might think, atheism is the weakest of worldviews, which is likely why God's word says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God."
Because one can never say that and be honest. One can say, I see absolutely no reason to believe that a God exists. One cannot say there is no God. We can't know that. But one can very, very, very strongly believe it.
Psalm 14, verse 1.
And now that most of my hair's vanished once again, I'd just like to say a huge thank you again to everybody who is supporting Seeking Eye and the project going forward. I do truly hope that you find value in these member-only videos, and your continued support through purchasing access to these videos really does go a long way to help me keep Seeking Eye going. So I will continue to work at getting more of these member-only videos out for you, hopefully weekly, although I can't say for sure, and I will do absolutely everything I can to make sure that you feel that your value in subscribing to the channel and to joining as a member really is truly appreciated. So again, thank you very much for stopping by for this video, and I will see you in the next one.